Hey, what's up guys? I'm back with another camera review. Today I'm talking about the Pentax K1000. Pentax produced this camera from 1976 all the way up through 1997. So they produced this thing for 21 years and they made 3 million of these things. So this is not a rare camera. It's a very popular camera. And it's pretty significant that they produced it up until 1997 because in the 90s, all the major manufacturers like Nikon, Canon, Minolta, and even Pentax themselves, they were well into producing autofocus bodies and lenses. And so the fact that Pentax produced an all-manual, all-mechanical film SLR for that long and well into the 90s, that's pretty significant. So that kind of speaks to how incredible this camera is. And I'm going to go into the why of that a little bit later, but I wanted to talk about its history a little bit. It basically evolved from the Pentax Spotmatic. The biggest difference between the Spotmatic and the K1000 is the mount. The Spotmatic is an M42 screw mount. So the lens screws on and off. Pretty simple, you know, nice and sturdy. Spotmatic is a terrific camera, but the K1000 is a K-mount, which is a bayonet mount, which is more common in the later cameras produced in, I believe starting in the 70s. But you just press this lock right here, and the lens pops right off. You just twist it, and it pops right off. And it's nice, it's secure, it's fast. And that's the biggest difference, other than the metering system of the Spotmatic and the metering system of the Pentax. There's a few other differences, but you can see that they are very similar cameras, and that this K1000 is really an evolution of this Spotmatic. So let's go into the production of this thing for a little bit. These were made in Japan for many years. Later in the production run, they sent production to China, I believe in Hong Kong. This particular one was assembled in Hong Kong. It says right on that label there. You probably can't pick that up, but it says assembled in Hong Kong. These two were made in Japan. So, and this Hong Kong one and this Japan one, they're essentially the same. They use all the same materials. Supposedly Pentax are overseeing production, and for all intents and purposes, they're the same camera. But even later in the production run, they started making the top and bottom plates plastic. So there was a little bit of skimping in the materials there later in the production run. The biggest giveaway on a plastic top K1000 is it does not have the Asahi name above Pentax. So I don't know if you can see that, or just Google any picture of a Pentax K1000. But right above Pentax is just in a smaller typeface, it says Asahi. So if you see that, a K1000 without that, then you know it's got a plastic top and it was made in China. The workmanship was just fine. They did not skip on the quality of workmanship. It was just the materials that they used that they I guess skimped on a little bit. But they were still good cameras, and I still would highly recommend them. I want to talk about a notable Pentax K1000 user, which I'm a huge fan of. His name is Glenn Friedman. If you're not familiar with his work, or you're not familiar with his name, you have definitely seen his photographs. If you've ever seen a picture of the Beastie Boys, LL Cool J, Run DMC, or getting into more obscure punk rock stuff like Black Flag, Minor Threat, Fugazi, you've seen Glenn Friedman's work. He's on Instagram. He's real active on Instagram. He's on Twitter. He's got a blog, and he's an amazing artist. And he is a Pentax K1000 user. I don't know what he uses to this day. I don't think he's like a huge gear nerd, but he has, talked about using his Pentax K1000 and how he's produced a lot of work with it. So I really admire him as an artist. And if you're interested in seeking out other photographers and you're interested in their tools, Glenn E. Friedman is a good place to start if you're interested in the Pentax K1000. So anyway, let's get into the features of this thing. I showed you the lens mount. There's this little lock here. You disengage that lock and you take off that lens. Pretty simple. The Pentax K1000, the Pentax K mount lenses, obviously the optics are spectacular. They're wonderful lenses. This particular lens is a 50mm f1.4. I found it at a thrift shop. Actually, all 3 of these, I found these all at thrift shops. They were all under 40 bucks. I think the most expensive one was this one that I just found. that was pointed out to me by my buddy Rob from Compact Camera Club. I'm going to link his Instagram and Twitter below. But he told me that he spotted this at a thrift store. It was 29 bucks, and I grabbed it. Going into their features, we talked about the lens. You've got your shutter button up top. You've got the advance lever. Pretty simple stuff. Every time you shoot a frame, you advance it and you shoot. This is your shutter speed dial. It goes from bulb all the way to 1/1000th of a second. The sync speed is a 60th of a second. So your flash sync speed is not really all that impressive. It's got this port right here, but it's also got a hot shoot. So, but you know, your flash sync speed is less than impressive. So if flash sync is important to you, you might want to think about that. But you know, I never use a flash, or I rarely use a flash with film cameras, unless it's like a point and shoot or something. So you know, maybe that doesn't matter to you. But if it does, just know it syncs up to a 60th of a second. No faster than that. But it does go from bulb to 1/1000th of a second. The ISO is changed with this dial. So you lift this dial, and there's a little window that you see, and so whatever you put in that window, that's the ISO it's gonna meter at. So let's talk about that meter. They call it full scene averaging. It's not center weighted, it's more spread out than center weighted. So and they call it full scene averaging. So so just know that when you're metering a scene, you might want to observe the outer edges of the frame a little bit more, and how that exposure, or how those light levels will affect your exposure when you're metering against it, because it's not a center weighted, definitely not a spot meter. It's definitely not a center weighted meter. It's spread out a little bit more than that. I mean, it's a pretty good meter. I've never had any real issues with it. I think as far as meters go, it's nice and accurate. I've never had any problems with it. If you look through the viewfinder, what you'll see is a needle, basically. There's plus and minus. So when you're metering a scene, the needle's basically going to move, and if it's plus, it's overexposed, and you want to adjust your aperture and your shutter speed accordingly. And if it's in the minus, if it's pointing downward, then it's underexposed, and you need to adjust. So that's what you see there. The bottom plate, there's not a whole lot there. You've got your film rewind unlock there. So when you're done at the end of the roll, you press that button, and then you rewind your film with this knob here. This knob also doubles as the lock that disengages the film door back. So pretty simple stuff. If you've ever shot with a film camera, you've seen this 1,000 times. But yeah, you load your film up in there. Pretty simple stuff. It uses a single LR44 battery, or SR44 battery. That is the silver oxide type. And that's actually pretty handy, because most cameras use two. The Pentax K1000 only uses one. Couple of tips on the battery life of this thing. So if the lens cap is on and light is hitting the lens, the meter is active. So that battery is slowly being drained. So, you know, there's no on-off switch on this camera. The only way to really turn it off, so to speak, is to put a lens cap on it, or put it away in your bag, because otherwise, if light is hitting the lens, it is metering. So for me, the biggest allure of a Pentax K1000 is just its utter simplicity. I mean, it's well built, it feels good, it's simple, and all those things kind of come together into a tool that is so usable and such a pleasure to use that, and I think that's what makes it really effective. I talked about its reliability. I've talked about its features and its simplicity. Ergonomically, I mean, it doesn't have any kind of grip here, but it just feels good in your hand. It's not really awkward to hold in any certain places. It's not real heavy. And I think that's what really makes this thing magical to use. When you're out shooting with it, once you're used to it, and it doesn't take a whole lot of time to get used to this thing, it just kind of disappears in your hands. I know a lot of people say that about a lot of cameras, but I really feel that that's true about this camera. I've never once felt like there was anything strange about it that got in the way of the operation. And again, I think that a lot of that goes back to its simplicity. Now, because of its simplicity, a lot of people, I know of at least a few people that have considered this a boring camera. And I mean, that's fine, I guess. That's that's fair. But for me, that's why I think it's so effective, is that it's not any more than you need. It just kind of, you've got your manual controls, you've got your shutter, you've got your advance, and that's really all there is to it. Another thing I do want to point out about this is there is another version called the SE version. I assume that stands for Special Edition, but it had the split prism focus mechanism. Pentax K1000s, the regular version, they have a micro prism, so they do not have that very popular split prism. So that's something you might want to consider if your eyesight is not great. That might be an issue for focusing. There is no split prism. It's just got the micro prism. As far as that goes, though, the viewfinder is nice and big. It's bright. It's easy to focus with. But if you prefer and you like that split prism focusing mechanism, you want to look for the SE version, or really any other camera that has that, because they're pretty common. But the Pentax K1000 does not. The last thing I want to go into is, if you're looking for one of these, just, stop in your thrift shops. They're not rare cameras at all. So check out those thrift shops. There's also groups on Facebook. There's also eBay. And these are, at the moment, they're climbing in price, but they're still pretty reasonable. Like I said, I found all of these at thrift shops. They all function perfectly well. They are all under 40 bucks. I think one of them was even, $20 with a lens. It looked real junky. It was covered in dirt, but I cleaned it up and it's in spectacular condition. That was this one here. They're pretty easy to find. I guess that also depends on your geography and where you are, but there's all kinds of websites like KEH, the Film Photo Gear group on Facebook, that you can check out, where a lot of people are selling these. Again, these are not rare cameras. They're pretty easy to find. So if you're starting out in film photography, I highly recommend this camera, just like everybody else does, just for all the reasons I mentioned before. Another thing I want to add about the price of these things is what I just said about what I paid for these. That's not typical market price on these. I think these are climbing above $100, and if you find one for $100, I think that's a pretty good deal. I'm sure people will tell you it's not, it's way too expensive, or that's way too cheap, but I think that's just where the market is as of this video. I don't decide the market does, but my point is that if you keep your eyes open, you might get lucky and you might find one at a thrift store or something. But again, those prices, the $40 that I paid for the most expensive one that I have is not a typical market price. Well, that's it, guys. That's all I've got for you on the Pentax K1000. Check this thing out. It's a fun camera. I highly recommend it. And if you like videos about film cameras and gear, please subscribe. Check out the website. All that stuff is linked below. And thanks for taking the time to join me today, guys.